So we do have an incredible time that we are in right now. And, you know, we can spend a lot of time talking about the things that are going to be issues and challenges, because we're going to have them. But one thing I'd like to challenge you to do as we get started today is think about the fact that we have a chance to really make change. Because I meet people all the time who tell me everything that could go wrong. I mean, it's actually kind of funny, talking about the age change. There are two statements I get all the time. The first one is, I thought you'd be older, which I guess as long as I keep getting that one, that's a good one. The other one is, oh, you have such a hard job. Yeah, well, but it's worth it. This is an incredible time. And so I think I'd like to start by just simply asking you the question, are you happy with where we are right now? I'm not. We've got kids out there who are not ready. We have kids out there who are ignored. We have kids out there who are going to graduate and have to take care of me when I'm in a nursing home. And those kids are not necessarily going to be ready for science literacy in the 21st century. So what I want to tell you is a standards document is not going to fix the world's problems. But what we have an opportunity to do is change the equilibrium. I love speaking to science teachers because I can actually use this analogy, not be stared at blankly like I am when I speak to policymakers. The way to change a system at equilibrium is to perturb the system, to create a stress on the system. These standards have the opportunity to do that. But the fact is, everybody's got to know going into this, it's not going to be the only thing. What's actually going to make the difference are the people in this room. There's never a decision made by any policymaker that can actually have full reform. It's what happens when the teacher stands in front of the children. So, as we're going through this, you can tell me about all the things that could go wrong. I know. You know how when you get to fifth period and you know the questions the kids are going to ask? I'm in fifth period right now. Okay, I know all the stuff that could happen, all the stuff that could go wrong. But I also know this. We have an opportunity, and we kind of need to make sure we don't screw this up. So when you do a standards project, here's the thing this is the way I always think about it. Everybody needs to leave a little bit mad. In other words, nobody's going to be happy with everything that's in the document. There's going to be things that you won't be great, but the bottom line is, are we moving the ball down the field? So, having said all that, I'm not going to do, it's really interesting. I had the great opportunity, and I'm so thankful to Francis for letting me speak at all the regionals. So I look out and I see a lot of you here. And it's always great to know people will come hear you a second time. The scary thing is I actually see where some of you have seen me 3 or 4. So this is not my typical stump speech. It's actually a little bit different. To be honest with you, I'm a little nervous about it because I'm not going into the detail about the framework like I normally do because there's other stuff I want to get to. But I do want to start by just making sure everybody kind of understands a little bit of a timeline here. Back in the 90s, we had 2 fantastic documents, the National Science Education Standards and the Benchmarks for Science Literacy. Those were really 2 groundbreaking documents that helped move the country forward with realizing the importance of science education and the role of the inquiry and the role of students really being scientifically literate. States took those documents and they developed their own state standards. So one question I get a lot is, how is this time different? Well, one thing to know is that those 2 documents were not necessarily developed for a state to take to their State Board of Education and say, here, please adopt these. They guided that development. They were supposed to guide what happened with assessment and instruction. So they were fantastic base documents. I used them in Georgia. In fact, I would say that virtually all of you here have something in your state standards that deal with those. But then the problem was there were 2. And so you had to pick and choose. And then on top of that, states interpreted them differently and frankly gave different levels of expectation to their kids. Since then, there have been a lot of work done by the National Research Council, which is the staffing arm of the National Academies, to develop research-based documents on how science can best be taught in schools and really how kids learn science. The learning sciences have been critical to this in that we're not just simply doing the old scope and sequence which says, hey, I think this goes better because it leads into that. But there's actually been work done about how learning works for kids and is there a better progression. So those two documents, or those several documents, folded into what was released back in July of 2011, the Framework for K-12 Science Education. This is the base document that the Next Generation Science Standards is being based on. So just as a real brief thing, I have to push all of you. I have to challenge you. If you have not read this document, you need to read it. If you've read this document, you need to read it again. Because what we're seeing as people review standards is people tend to fall into one of three groups. People who really understand the framework, and to be clear, the vision behind the framework. Not just what the thing says in words, but the vision behind it. We have people who have read the framework, okay? And to be honest with you, that's where it gets interesting because they've read it so they are able to quote from it, but they generally quote it out of context or they quote it to try to keep what they want in their standards. And then you got the third group, which are the people who haven't read the framework or maybe even know that the framework exists. And that's also dangerous. Here's the thing. We have states that have traditionally had a very difficult time with science education. I know this is going to be a shock. There are some controversial issues in science. I don't know if you know that or not. So in the 90s, we had two documents from the scientific community. Somewhat, I mean, a great deal of overlap, but somewhat divided. Now we have the national academies as one voice coming out with the science community saying this is the science that kids should know by the time they graduate high school. That's a tremendous authority given to states and given to teachers by the group of scientists. This 18-member committee, which included 2 Nobel Prize winners, which was kind of cool. Some of you have heard me say this before. You know, I had kind of one of those moments in my life, you know, where you get kind of starstruck, and then you do something so incredibly stupid you just want to die. I was having a great conversation with Dudley Hirschbeck, winner of the 1986 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And for some reason, the teacher in me came out, and I felt the need to explain something to Dudley. I stopped in mid-sentence and went, I am so sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. I just need to leave now. And Dudley was such a great guy. He was like, oh, no, Stephen, it's great. It was really informative. I'm like, oh my gosh. I just had a Nobel Prize winner tell me something was informative. He's just incredibly kind. Anyway, so now we're taking this document and we're working with a group of states and with a group of writers to develop the next generation science standards. This is a state-led effort. It is in many ways like the Common Core state standards in that it's state-led, but we're not calling it that because it is a different process. And what makes it different is that framework. Understanding that framework, giving the authority from the scientific community was tremendous. But we're now in this process of developing these standards. And so the state-led process, just so you have an idea, we have 26 states that have signed on as lead state partners. And what that means is that the state school superintendent and the state board chair have signed off saying that they would give serious consideration to the adoption of the standards as presented. Now, to be clear what that means, I know some people are going, serious consideration, really? Okay. Would anybody in this room sign a contract that you didn't read? Well, that's probably not a good example because we're all teachers. I don't know about you, but I never read my contract very well. Let me rephrase it. Would you ever buy a car without reading the contract or a house without reading the contract? Well, the fact is that, you know, we couldn't ask a state to sign on sight unseen. That would be crazy. And so these folks have just said, yes, we're going to sign on. We want to understand this, and we want to be a lead partner. So that 26 states, those are 58% of the public school population in the country. So I get to ask the question all the time, well, what's going to happen? You know, there's a certain, you know, group of states that people worry about whether they're adopting or not because they influence the textbook market and all that. Well, I can tell you, no one state has 58% of the public school population. Talk about a change in a business model. So on top of that, there's another initiative going on with the Council of State Science Supervisors called the Building Capacity for State Science Education, BCSSE. In that initiative, 45 states have been meeting to talk about the adoption and implementation of the framework and standards. So this is actually something that has legs, as we used to say in state government. This is something that we'll be able to move forward. So the Next Generation Science Centers, what I want to very quickly do is just make everybody very clear about this. What is really different? We've always had inquiry, we've always had content, we've always had cross-cutting or unifying themes, right? Here's the difference. The vision laid out in the framework is the intersection between those three things. It's not any one of those. It's not where historically in state standards where we've had a set of content standards over here and a set of inquiry standards over here, which means that sometimes people forget one side, and particularly assessment tends to forget one side, but actually how do those things actually intersect? The nexus of that is what the vision of this really is all about. It's about really having kids experience science and use how we think as scientists to convey that. So, you know, it's a pretty incredible change to put that into place where you can't just simply forget about it and go back to, you know, which of the following is anaphase. Now, biology friends, I don't mean to offend you, not probably the most important thing that every kid needs to know. The orientation of spindle fibers in anaphase, right? But understanding why cell division is important is really critical. So I'd like to take a second and talk to you a little bit about here are some shifts in how we have to think about these new standards. So first, the standards are being written as performance expectations. So what that means is we are taking the vision of the framework and really implementing that to the point of being able to say that practices are associated intentionally with content so that you can't just simply drop one off. We can't continue to let our kids engage in intellectual bulimia and think that we're teaching science. Okay, now if you can't figure out what that is, they're binging on lots of great facts, they're walking in on test day, yakking that up, and they walk away with a bad taste in their mouth. Okay, that's pretty much the way you got to think about, unfortunately, how we've done a lot of science education. So these performance expectations now are where students are going to have to construct an explanation based on evidence that does this, or they use models to predict certain phenomena, and that those practices have to be connected to the content in a way that's meaningful and in a way that's clear for you as teachers, and let's also be really clear, to be clear to assessment developers. The second thing is that the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts are continuums. So here's what I mean by that. When you see a performance expectation, there will be a practice associated with a piece of content. Standards are threshold documents. They are a contract. They are what a teacher should know that their kids are going to be held responsible for on an assessment. But in the classroom, you should not be restricted by having one practice associated with content. In the classroom, you should always run the full spectrum of all 8 practices. And let's be real. If one of those performance expectations tells you to conduct an investigation, can you really do that without collecting evidence and analyzing evidence? No. Can you really do that without having kids develop an explanation? No. But those practices are what are emphasized for the purposes that once an assessment is built, it's very clear what that is. So here's our options. We can do what we've always done and keep them separate, meaning that it's easy to just ignore one because it's cheaper, right? Or because it's, you know, it's easier, it's less time consuming. And, you know, we all know what happens when we do what we've always done. We get what we always got. The other option is we can do similar to what, for instance, we did in Georgia, where we have a setup, we had the same setup. You had a set of characteristics of science, you had a set of content, and we double-coded the items. And I had teachers that would come into my office and say, but Stephen, which one should I emphasize with which content? Isn't it more fair for me to know what my kids are actually being assessed on? I don't care if you assess them, but just tell me what you're going to assess them on. So I think that's fair. But you as a teacher need to understand that it's about a continuum. Science concepts build over time. So we're not doing the old spiral curriculum where you do the same thing every year. We're not doing butterflies and volcanoes and, you know, killing bean seeds every year. You know, spiraling, you're supposed to get more complex. So, you know, your first year you put the bean in the wet paper towel and put it in the window. In first grade, the kid gets to wet their own paper towel. Second grade, they get to use dirt. Okay, that's not what we mean. What we mean is that you can't teach the kinetic molecular theory in 2 weeks in high school. You also can't teach science from 6 through 12. It's got to be something that progresses over time with a very concentrated view of content and of practice. We also know that there's got to be a greater focus on understanding as opposed to memorization. If you go out and ask people right now, if you were to walk out on the street and say, what do you remember about science? They're going to tell you 9 planets. They're going to tell you they learned something about mitosis maybe. Then they did some cool labs. In other words, it's all going to be about facts. We want to move past that in thinking about how to think about the world. And it's not just good enough to memorize the names of laws and the names of people who came up with those laws. It's actually about being able to apply those laws. Integrating science and engineering is huge. Now, we're not developing full engineering coursework, but science and engineering are symbiotic. They have to work together. So don't think that we're going to load a lot of more content on you by that. Most of you are already doing something with engineering. Just call it what it is. If you're already doing an egg drop, guess what? You did engineering. I'm not saying, I don't want to diminish that because there's actually a lot more to it, but let's be more informed. And then finally, coordinating with Common Core state standards. There's so, you know, we have, most of the states at this point have adopted at least one part of the Common Core state standards. We need to recognize that we are educating children. And folks, if you know, I really want you to hear this. Science is critically important for success in the 21st century. But an educated child is absolutely necessary for the United States to be successful, period. Which means that it's not just about science. It's about educating a child. So we can't turn a blind eye to what's going on with math and language arts. We actually need to embrace that. In fact, the way this has worked has been so nicely done because there's such an overlap of what makes a child literate from a critical thinking perspective that we have a great opportunity. There's a study being done at Stanford University right now where they took the math practices, the science and engineering practices, and the student profiles from English language arts. Look at that overlap. When we talk about these things, we are taking great pains to make sure that these things are connected and that when we talk about, I mean, I'll never forget the kid that walked into my third period physical science class and he said, I can't remember, we were doing heat or something. He said, now I coach track, so he said, Coach Pruitt, that looks a lot like math. I said, yes. He said, but this is third period. This is science. Maybe we should realize that there's got to be more coordination. So, how are these standards actually going to look? Now, I know that the cameras are going to go up. I can already see people getting ready. So here's what you got to know. What I'm going to show you may or may not still be in the draft. But the important part is I want you to see where we're headed. So first of all, again, the idea of understanding the nexus here, the connections and intersection between the practices, the cross-cutting concepts, and the disciplinary core ideas. These are what are called foundation boxes. When you see those, what our intent is, now, some of y'all have heard me say this joke a lot, but it works. How many of you ever played education bingo? It's the greatest game in the world. If you've not done it, you need to do it. What you do is when you're going to any type of education meeting, you know you're going to hear a certain number of buzzwords, make a bingo card out of it, and sit there with your friends and play education bingo. So I'm about to use one of those words. When you get a new set of standards, what does every state, every district, every school think the first thing you got to do with a new set of standards? Unpack them. We got to unpack the standards. I hate that word. Oh my gosh. It is the most disgusting word. I can't stand it. But here's the thing. To write these standards, you know what we've got to do? We got to pack them. So just leave the suitcase open. Okay? So here's the thing. These foundation boxes, which you're going to see, what we want to do is communicate to you what is in the performance. So this is actually not our best example. I did that on purpose. But the blue box with science, engineering, practice, that should tell you what it means to do, in this case, analyzing and interpreting data. What in that grade band should you be doing with that practice? Okay? The dictionary core idea, that should tell you what the understanding is from a content perspective. Now don't read that and try to figure out all the extra stuff to put in there. This is about the focus of what kids should know from a conceptual perspective. And then the cross-cutting concepts, those are the connective tissue. How do I know that what I'm doing over in physical sciences is translating to life sciences? So then we develop the performance expectation. Here we have a performance expectation that says analyzing and interpreting data to explain. Okay, stop right there. That's a practice. That's in blue. Notice that it's coordinated with the blue below. Now, for those of you who don't like the color, because about half of you are going to love it, half of you are going to hate it. On the web, you'll be able to click a button for black and white. But for presentation purposes, it actually works quite nicely. So, analyzing, interpreting data to explain. First of all, explanation. Remember in your current state standards, when you see the word explain, that's a Bloom verb, okay, which usually means regurgitate the definition that I gave you half an hour ago, okay? Scientific explanation means you have evidence. Evidence to support the explanation. So, analyze and interpret data to explain, okay? The kinetic and molecular theory, energy of an object is proportional to the mass of a moving object, and it grows with the square of its speed. So the orange is the focus of the content. There's only one word in green, but that's because understanding proportionality is a cross-cutting concept. There's a little red statement you can't see there. That's called an assessment boundary statement. Now, it's not an instructional boundary statement, but what it is meant to do is communicate to assessment developers, we don't want you to assess this part. Again, as a teacher, you should go beyond the standards. In fact, if you don't go beyond the standards, you're doing a disservice to your children. But what this is a great equalizer. We just want to make sure every kid gets at least the same stuff. Then we have connections boxes. These connections boxes are actually the components that blend across the same grade level. Vertically, what did a kid do in elementary school before they get to you, and what are they going to do after you if you're in middle school? And then also the connection to the Common Core. In particular in elementary school where you're a self-contained teacher, we wanted you to pick up one document and look at it and go, wow. So when I'm teaching this science standard, I can also be using this math and this language arts. You buy economy of time when you think about these things holistically and not in pieces. When you see these performance expectations, if you go through and you try to say, well, that takes 2 weeks, and that takes 2 weeks, and that takes 2 weeks, so that's the 6 weeks, you're not thinking about it right. It's a conceptual delivery to students. It may be that you can combine those three and actually teach all three of them in a 2 or 3 week time period. So one thing here is I want to just point out that's a big difference is explanation and argument. This is why these foundation boxes are actually really important. If I were to ask a poll right now, how many of you know the difference between explanation and argument? First of all, everybody raise their hand because you'd be afraid not to. But there would be some of you who would go, I really don't know. Because what is the real difference? This has been a really hot topic of discussion. this is where we're headed, that explanations are the products of science. Arguments are the process by which those products or those explanations are reached. So one's actually a process, one's actually an endpoint. So like if you see a performance expectation that says construct an argument that supports the claim that, blah, 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 or supports the explanation that. We got feedback from states and from other people that said, wait a minute, you're telling us which side of the argument to be on. Scientific argument is not about always debate. It's actually about the process of reaching an explanation. It's that nature of science component that actually helps kids understand that theories change because new arguments arise with new evidence, and that explanation changes as a result. So you'll also see in the document a matrix that will show you the progression of these science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts over time. So in this case, don't even try to read this, but this is what will populate the blue box. This is going to be where there will be a theme that says, here's what the focus in this grade band is for this particular practice, and then there will be bullets that are basically criteria that says, here's what kids should really be doing. We also are going to have a chapter on equity and diversity. This is absolutely critical to success, that we actually really fully understand how important it is that all kids have access to this. So this is about all standards, all students. So we have a subcommittee who's really working to make sure that the standards don't have bias in them in their actual language. I mean, they're going through and saying, okay, when you talk about, there are certain terms that can be used as verbs or nouns. And to an English language acquisition student, you've got to really pay attention to that. But we also want to be able to give context. We want to be able to give you vignettes that says, here's how all kids can access these standards. We also know that we're not working on just a standards document. We're working on trying to get these implemented with fidelity. So we're working with states around the idea of college and career readiness, support within the states, adoption and implementation planning, and science education policies. What that means is we're not just going to put these out and say, states, have at it. We want to really work with them. College and career readiness is actually a huge issue. Right now, you may hear all the time people talking about college and career readiness. It's hit the lexicon, which is always dangerous, because now who knows what it means anymore. Well, in language arts and math, it had some very specific meaning. For us, it's tough. We've got some real issues. We've got this decentralized education system. We've got very few colleges and universities have remediation courses in science, which was a key definition for language arts and math. The kids go right into credit-bearing coursework. We have a tremendous disparity among the expectations of colleges and universities of what they expect. In Common Core, basically the definition was students go into credit-bearing coursework, they can be successful in college algebra and freshman English. The problem with science is no remediation courses, and which is the first science? It could be chemistry, it could be physics, it could be earth-space science, it could be geology. In some places, it's geography. You know, so how do you begin? So we are having conversations, and we're basically in evidence-gathering mode of how do we really define that? Because what we really want is kids to finish the first year of school, of college, successfully, meaning that they don't, not only do they not fail the course, they don't drop it after 2 weeks. So currently, we met with a small group, and our current thinking is that the framework equals science literacy. So if that equals literacy, then that literacy should also equate to college readiness. We're also having the conversation that this should be done in at least 3 years of high school, as opposed to 2 years in some states. Career readiness is something we're continuing to work on, because career readiness in science is actually a little different too, because STEM fields are very huge. We don't want just the PhD students. They're important. I was one, so you know, I think I'm important. But also the fact that we've got kids who are going to need to go work in, who are going to go straight into the workforce, so they're going to go through a community college, they also have STEM needs. This is our website, nextgenscience.org. We have a public feedback that's coming up. In the next month, this is going to be public. Please, we want everybody in here to comment. I can assure you a human is going to read every comment that comes in. Now, it won't be me personally, because that'll be a lot of comments. But we are committed to doing the job that's going to be helpful to you. Now, this is big. At this very moment, there's a button being pushed back in D.C. and Achieve. We're about to do a press release on what I'm about to talk about. This has not been discussed in public because we've been waiting for today. This is really exciting. You always wonder, and I always get the question, how is the public going to react to new science standards and to common science standards? Well, we did a survey. We surveyed voters from across the country to find out what is the attitude going to be toward science education in general and then toward a new set of science standards that potentially could be common across states. First of all, voters are virtually unanimous, 97% in believing that improving the quality of science education is important to the United States' ability to compete globally. Do you know how odd it is to have a 97%? Now, understand, this was not a small N size. I didn't do like, 3 out of 4 didn't surveyed. I mean, this was a huge Gallup-type poll, right, that really we wanted to find out what's going on. 97%. That's tremendous. The majority of voters give the quality of science education a grade of C or below, both nationally and in their local schools. Now, where that's kind of interesting is most people they can talk about how other people's schools are bad, but they'll say, oh, but we're doing okay. But actually, these are pretty close. Most voters, 56%, regardless of gender, education, location, or political affiliation, believe science education in the United States ranks behind most other countries. People are ready for change. Similar voters' views on English language arts and math, by a margin of 2 to 1, voters prefer for states to have the same science standards so that students across the country have a chance to meet the same expectation. What Francis was saying earlier, unheard of in the United States, that people actually want standards that are going to be common across states. 2 to 1 is just an incredible, statistically significant margin. When informed that a group of states were leading an effort to develop the new standards and there will be internationally benchmarked, more challenging and require students to apply their knowledge and how those concepts fit together, voters overall showed broad support, 87%, for the new standards. We stand at an incredible place in history. We can't afford to mess this up because people are ready for this change. So what do we need to do now? And then I'm going to open it up for questions. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think this, and if you don't hear anything else, hear this part. What do we need now? Courage. We need the courage to be patient. We need the courage to try things that are different. We need the courage to be uncomfortable. Folks, if you are comfortable when you are implementing these new standards, I'm going to be real honest with you, you're probably not implementing the new standards. I hear people all the time talking about how, oh, they're not that different. Oh, in some cases we're already aligned to these. Blah, blah, blah. This is an incredible opportunity, but it's going to require some discomfort. We're working with the states to talk about we need to have the courage to be patient. Now, what does that really mean? The courage to be patient. See, it's easy to do stuff fast. It's easy just to announce to all the teachers in the state, we're going to implement in the fall, and walk away. What's challenging and what takes courage is the thoughtful introspection and analysis to build an infrastructure that can support a change of this magnitude. That states and districts and teachers are paying attention, that we are being the professionals that we all want to be, and thinking clearly about how we want to move forward. That we're doing this for children and not for our own personal comfort's sake. I mentioned I was a coach. I was a track coach. I love the pole vault. The best pole vaulters have the courage to be patient. And it takes courage. You hand a 15-year-old kid a 14-foot long pole and say, run as fast as you can, stick the pole in the hole in the ground and jump. It's easy just to get it done. But the good ones plant and they wait and they let the pole do the work. Okay, we have got to let the standards take hold. The pole in this case is the framework. Right this very second, you can start embracing that framework and understanding the vision, and you can start moving us toward a place that we can be successful. But we've got to have the courage to be patient. Now,